The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $85, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Emmett Cole did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at what he had bought. A steam road roller, 10 tons of it, sunk to its rims in the weeds where it had stood cold for a quarter of a century. The great cast rolls had rusted the color of dried blood. The tall smokebox and its stubby chimney were scaled orange from the rain. The boiler barrel wore its cracked, lagging like a shed skin, and the flywheel and the motion and the steering worm were seized under a crust of rust and burdock. Somewhere under all of it, on the round door at the front, was a maker's badge nobody had troubled to wipe clean in 50 years. The whole of it read to the crowd as a dead iron dinosaur, too heavy to move and too far gone to run. Emmett had just paid $85 to own all of it, the seized rolls, the cold boiler, the rusted engine, and the badge under the grime. It was a bright, clear morning. The hard, clean light that pours across a country auction in early fall, at an estate sale on the old Reinhardt place at the edge of town. The machinery and the shop tools and the household goods ranged out on the grass, and back of it all, past the last shed, the steamroller that had helped lay every mile of hard road in that township before most of the crowd was born. Emmett was 72 years old, lean and a little stooped now, but sure in the hands, with a deeply lined face gone soft and weathered, close-cropped white hair under a flat cap, wire spectacles pushed up his nose, and pale, patient eyes. His hands were broad and scarred and careful, the fingers still steady the way a steam engineer's stays steady when he has spent a life reading boilers and setting heavy iron in motion. He had come up in steam young, a licensed engineer and a boiler man, one of the last in the county who could raise steam in a road roller of a cold morning and read a boiler's health the way another man reads a page. Until the diesel rollers and the motor graders came, the steam iron was condemned and scrapped one machine at a time. And the men who could run a road engine by its gauge and its sound were quietly turned out. He kept the town's pumps and furnaces since, but the smell of hot oil and coal smoke never left him. The man who laughed was Dale Pruitt, who ran the biggest scrap iron yard in 3 counties, a heavy-set man of about 55 in a loud cherry-red windbreaker he wore to be seen in, clean-shaven and ruddy, a thick gold ring on one hand and a fat unlit cigar in the other. $85, Dale said, loud, so the whole lot could hear it. $85 for a dead-iron dinosaur. That boiler's rusted so thin it wouldn't hold the steam to boil an egg, the rolls are froze to the ground, and it'd cost you more than $85 just to drag it out of the weeds. There's no engine in that heap, old-timer, there's a dinosaur. You bought 10 tons of scrap that thinks it's a machine, and the privilege of cutting it up yourself. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry, the dinosaur, and it stuck for the rest of that month, because a great rusted road roller sunk in the burdock, with its chimney canted and its rolls locked, did look like nothing so much as some iron beast that had lain down in the field to die. The crowd laughed because Dale laughed, the way a crowd does. Emmett stood through it without a change in his face, his hands folded quiet in front of him, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world leaned on when it needed a hard thing done and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe. because the people who stay for stories like Emmett's are who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Emmett said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What Dale Pruitt could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Emmett had walked that roller at daylight, before the sale opened, with a lifetime of steam awake in him. The crowd saw rust heap. Emmett saw the engine. The lagging was rotted and the paint was gone, but the lagging was never the engine. The iron under it was the engine, and the engine was all there. He had tapped the boiler barrel end to end with a little hammer and heard no dead flat note of a rotten plate, only the live ring of sound, steel under scale. The great flywheel would not turn, but it was whole. The cylinder and the slide and the motion were seized, not broken. The rolls were sound. The steering worm and the winding drum and the gears were all in their places under the rust. Emmett knew what became of old steamrollers because he had watched it for 50 years, the boilers condemned and sold for the copper in their tubes, the engines dragged onto the scrap drives and cut up for the war, the whole machines torched where they stood until a road roller survived only as a photograph and a story. What sat sunk in the Reinhardt weeds was, so far as he could tell from the ground, all there, every part a working engine needed, still together, still one machine. And a whole steamroller unbutchered was the one thing the old steam men said you would never see again. Emmett had come up hard. He went into steam young, firing and oiling for a road crew before he was strong enough for the regulator, apprenticed to an old road engineer who ran a fleet of rollers for the county and taught him the whole of it. How to raise steam clean and quick of a frost morning, how to read a water glass and a pressure gauge and know a boiler's health by the color of its washings, and last and rarest, how to tend the iron itself, to test a boiler cold and hot, to caulk a seam and set a stay and coax a seized engine back to life without cracking a casting. He and his wife, Marion, had followed the work through the good years, Emmett running the engine, Marion keeping the crew's time and the logs in her careful hand, until the diesels came and the steam fleets went cold, one machine at a time. And the county had no more use for a man whose whole trade was live fire and cast iron. Marion had died after a long illness, and they had raised no family of their own, and after she was gone he lived alone in a small house behind his shop with his rows of tools and his quiet. The town had a use for his wrench and no use at all for his trade. A man who had spent his life keeping heavy iron alive could no more walk past the county's last whole steamroller going for scrap than walk past his own life, so he bid, because he had seen, under the rust, the one thing that did not belong. If you've made it this far into Emmett Cole's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the estate first. The tractors and the tools and the household goods knocked down to the farmers and the pickers, while Emmett waited out by the sheds. When the auctioneer finally worked his way back to the old roller and called for a bid, Dale glanced over, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Emmett raised one finger, and the gavel came down at $85. He paid cash, signed the slip, and came back with a borrowed lowboy trailer, a winch, jacks, and a couple of strong backs, and spent the better part of 2 days freeing 10 tons of iron from the ground it had settled into and easing it up the ramps an inch at a time. He hauled it home at a walking pace with a flag on the back, the way a man moves something that could crush a car, and set it down in the big shed behind his shop where there was room to work all the way around it. The story got around the town before the trailer was unhitched. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the filling station to ask, grinning, whether he meant to sell tickets the day the dinosaur rolled. Verl Tanner, who ran the hardware counter, said it plainer, that there was nothing left in a boiler rained on for 25 years but rust and danger, that a cold boiler that old was as like to split as to steam, and that no man Emmett's age had any business on the footplate of a live road roller anyhow. Emmett was buying penetrating oil by the case, boiler gaskets and gauge glass and fire brick, flue brushes, packing for the glands, and a barrel of coal, and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent a life learning that a boiler is either sound or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. But Emmett did not go tearing into it in the daylight with the town still grinning. He got the roller home and blocked up level in the long shed, and then he went at it the slow way, alone, through the fall and the first winter, the way a man goes at anything a careful hand once built and time has nearly taken back. He stripped the rotted lagging to the bare boiler and went over every inch of the barrel and the firebox and the tubes, brushing and scaling and sounding the plate, and where he had feared the worst he found the boiler had been laid upright, fires dropped clean, the whole of it drained and greased and left dry under a tarp by somebody who knew exactly what he was doing. So that the steel had gone to surface rust and no deeper. He freed the seized engine a part at a time, soaking and warming and coaxing until the crank turned over and the slide valve slid. He drew the old packing and repacked the glands, ground the valves in, trued the eccentrics, and worked oil into 50 years of dry bearings until the motion moved sweet by hand. And it was the front of the machine he saved for last, the round smokebox door, and the badge bolted to the middle of it under a hard black shell of rust and old grease, and it was that badge that gave the whole thing up. Two things came out of that first winter that Emmett told nobody about for a while. The first came off the smokebox door. Working the last of the rust and grease from the badge one night, his brush came away from raised metal, and he set the brush down and worked the rest bare with a rag in his thumb, an oval maker's plate, the brass going dark but whole, and cast proud into the face of it a horse rampant, reared up on its hind legs, and above it and below it a single word he had to tilt to the lamp to read. Invicta, he knew the horse before he had the word clean. Every steam man of his generation knew the rampant horse of Kent, because it was the mark of the greatest maker of road rollers the world ever had, Aveling Porter of Rochester in Kent, England, who had built more steamrollers than any works on earth and cast the white horse of Kent and its old motto, Invicta, the undefeated, onto every engine they sent out. And low on the boiler barrel, under a second shell of scale, was the maker's plate itself, Aveling Porter, Limited, Rochester, Kent, and a works number stamped deep and plain. The number that works had given this one engine and no other on the day it was built. The second thing was in the toolbox bolted under the footplate. Wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, a steam engineer's boiler ticket gone soft with age, a stub of chalk, and a folded page of a road crew log. In a hand that had greased this engine and laid it up dry and left these things for whoever came next. Emmett sat down slow in the coal box with the boiler ticket in his hand, because he knew now whose engine this had been and what the man had done. August Reinhardt, Gus, the whole town had called him, had been the last road engineer the township ever kept on, the man who ran its little fleet of steamrollers when Emmett was young and watching from the ditch. When the diesels came and the order went out to scrap the steam iron for the war, Gus had cut up his own fleet with his own hands because he was told to. All but one. This one he had hauled home to the back of his own field on his own time, dropped its fire, drained it, greased it, laid it up dry under a tarp, and left his ticket and his log in the toolbox, meaning to bring it back some day when there was steam in the world again for an old roller to make. The day never came. Gus grew old and died, and the roller sat a quarter of a century in his weeds, being called a dinosaur, laid up right the whole time, whole and waiting, by the one man who could not stand to torch the last of them. The roller had its own long history, and the town had let it go for scrap iron money without once asking after it. Aveling and Porter had begun 2 men and a foundry by an English river and grown into the largest steam roller works on earth. When the hard highways were first laid, the works at Rochester shipped its engines to every corner of the world that was building roads. This one had crossed the ocean young, one of a fleet a growing township bought to pave its streets and its market square, and it had rolled hot tar and crushed stone flat under its own steam for 30 years, through Gus Reinhardt's whole working life, before the diesels made it old. Time was crueler to the rollers than to the works. When the trade of steam died, the engines were parted and torched the way Emmett had watched all his life, until a whole Aveling and Porter that could still be steamed survived almost nowhere, and the register the preservation men kept of the surviving engines, works number by works number, counted this one lost. The second winter belonged to the boiler, because a boiler is a thing you do not guess at. A steamroller is only as good as the pressure vessel under the man who stands on it, and a boiler cold for a quarter century has to earn back every pound of steam. Emmett did it the right way, the slow way, the only way. He scaled the barrel inside and out, cleaned the tubes and set the leaking ones, caulked the seams, renewed the stays he did not trust and the safety valve, and then he filled her with cold water and pumped her up past her working pressure with the cold hydraulic test and walked around her for an hour with a lamp, watching every seam and stay for a weep that never came. Only then did he light a small fire and warm her slow over a whole day. The way you bring an old boiler back so the iron never feels a shock, and raise steam in her for the first time in 50 years. When the needle came off the pin and climbed, and the safety lifted with a clean, hard scream, and the whole engine stood there breathing and ticking and alive in the cold shed, Emmett put his hand flat on the warm barrel and stood a while. The way a man stands when he hears a voice he had not heard in 30 years. Men who knew the trade would have paid admission for that day. The town figured he was still out there polishing scrap. In the spring, he wrote to the Steam Preservation Society that keeps the register of surviving Aveling importers, read the works number off the boilerplate into the letter. And a while later, a soft-spoken man who had spent his life among these engines drove a long way to see it, walked around the roller a long time without saying much, and went very still over the rampant horse on the smoke-box door and the number in the plate. Then he told Emmett plainly what he had. That works number was in the maker's own surviving records. It gave the year the engine was built at Rochester and the very fleet it had crossed the ocean with, a municipal roller fleet the register had long marked scrapped entire, every engine of it torched in the war drives, not one known to survive. This was the one. The sole survivor of its fleet, its papers traceable to the day it left the works, and, rarest of all, not a static hulk for a museum lawn, but a whole engine brought back to steam. A documented restored survivor of that class, he said, had brought $90,000 at a steam collection sale not long before. And this one, complete and steaming, its maker's plate and its horse intact and its history known to the year, was its equal or better. It was the last of its fleet that would ever raise steam again, and it did raise steam. The dinosaur the lot had laughed at held, in the iron of it, a small fortune, and, worth more than the money, the last whole survivor of a lost fleet, still wearing the mark of the greatest works that ever built a road roller, saved by a dead man who could not bear to cut up the last one. The next morning Emmett did not call a collector, and did not sell the roller away to sit dead and roped off on a museum lawn, and did not let it go to the scrap dealers who had laughed at it, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $85 for a dinosaur. And he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. Cutting the old engines up was the very thing that had killed them. One fleet at a time, Gus Reinhardt had saved this one against exactly that day, and Emmett had spent his whole life on the same side of that argument, keeping heavy iron alive and working instead of feeding it to the torch. There was no truth in doing to the last one what had been done to all the others. That part was never the point. So he did the harder thing. He set himself to finish her right, to see the works number written back onto the register with a living engine under it, and to find whatever family Gus Reinhardt had left, because somebody of Gus's ought to know what he had saved. Gus Reinhardt had a daughter living yet, a gray woman named Ruth in a mill town 2 counties over, who had grown up on the home place to the sound of that roller coming home of an evening, the huff and the chime of her father's engine drifting up the lane through the years of her girlhood, and who had signed the estate papers believing the rusted machine her father always meant to fix was a heap of scrap the auction had been lucky to get $85 for. Emmett went to her that spring with photographs of the steaming roller and the horse cleaned bright on the smoke box door, and last of all he put her father's boiler ticket in her hand and let her turn it over, soft and worn, in the hand that had greased the last engine of the fleet. She put a hand flat on the table and went quiet a long time. They had all thought the roller died with him. He was proof he had spent some of his own strength making sure it would not, dropping its fire clean, laying it up dry, leaving his ticket for whoever came, whenever they came. She asked Emmett why he had troubled himself, an old man, 2 winters, for a stranger's engine. He said only that a machine is a promise handed forward, from the works that built it to every man who ever stood on it, and that iron does not die, it waits, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to, and had rather leave the county its roller back. The first Saturday in June, Emmett steamed the roller up in the yard and let it be known, in the offhand way such things are let be known, that he meant to drive it down the road. The county came the way it comes to a thing it has laughed at, early and in numbers, and wearing its doubt where he could see it. Dale Pruitt parked his red pickup at the back of the crowd and stood by the tailgate with his cigar. Ruth Reinhardt stood up front by the flywheel where Emmett had asked her to stand. He built his fire and brought the needle up slow. And when the pressure stood where he wanted it, he eased the regulator open, and a great engine took its first breath in half a century and moved, the huge rear rolls turning, the motion swinging, the chimney beating soft and even, the whistle lifting one long, clear note across a county that had not heard that sound in a lifetime. Then he drove her out onto the road under her own steam, the way he had driven her kind for 50 years, the rampant horse on the smokebox catching the sun, and rolled a slow, clean pass down the blacktop and back while the crowd stood dead quiet, and then, all at once, not quiet at all. Nobody laughed. Somewhere at the back, a red pickup pulled out early. They kept the roller steaming where the county could see it and hear it. The Preservation Society wrote the works number back onto the register as the sole survivor of its fleet, the last of them anywhere that could still raise steam, and every fall after, the roller ran at the county steam and gas show, the horse polished bright on the smoke-box door. Gus Reinhardt's boiler ticket framed under glass on a post beside it for everybody to read. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter, and the people who had called Emmett a fool let the name the dinosaur drop and did not pick it up again. Dale Pruitt was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to walk up to, and the next time he held court at a sale the others did not lean in so far. And on a still evening that next fall, the light going gold across the showgrounds, Emmett Cole, the man who had been 72 years old the day that gavel fell and the whole auction laughed, stood by the roller after the crowd had thinned, the boiler ticking as it cooled, and laid one broad, scarred hand flat on the warm iron over the rampant horse, and nodded once the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had set it for him, the way work always did. A machine is a promise handed forward, the works casts its horse into the iron, and the last man to run her lays her up dry and leaves his ticket in the toolbox, both of them trusting that somebody will come along who can read iron and keep the promise, and a county rarely knows what it left to rust in the weeds until somebody troubles to raise steam in the thing it laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Emmett Cole right to keep the last of that fleet steaming in the open air, taking none of the fortune he could have had for it? Or should he have let it go to a museum, safe and cold under a roof, for money an old man could have used? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.